immediately staking a claim in the center, preparing to develop pieces and control key squares. Developing a knight to f6 immediately prepares for central pawn control, often aiming for c5 or e5, while keeping options open for various defenses. Establishing central control and preparing for queenside expansion, this pawn thrust immediately challenges the knight's influence. Solidifying the center while preparing to develop the king's bishop, this choice opens avenues for a Queen's Indian or Nimzo-Indian setup. Developing the knight solidifies the center's pawn structure and prepares for castling, a fundamental step in safeguarding the king. Immediately challenging white's central pawn structure, this move seeks to liberate black's position and initiate active piece play in the ensuing tension. Asserting central control while preparing for dynamic development, this knight enhances piece coordination. Developing the bishop prepares castling, subtly reinforcing the central pawn structure and readying for a potential queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to g5 pins the knight, creating immediate pressure on black's kingside and potentially disrupting their pawn structure. Safeguarding the monarch allows for flexible development and prepares for central pawn thrusts, solidifying black's queenside presence. Preparing for kingside expansion, this quiet pawn push reinforces the center and opens diagonals for the queen and light-squared bishop, while subtly restricting black's knight from reaching a more active square like c5. Solidifying the center and preparing for the queenside development, the knight finds a flexible outpost. Positioning the queen centrally on c2 bolsters the queenside advance potential, perhaps preparing a later b4 push, while simultaneously defending the e3 pawn and maintaining flexibility for the king's bishop. Challenging the bishop's influence on the queenside, this move introduces immediate tension and forces white to decide the fate of the pinned knight. Consider the potential structural weaknesses created by such pawn advances. Opening the center now might accelerate development, but it also creates an immediate target on the d-file for black's knight. Consider how this exchange impacts pawn structure and potential piece activity for both sides. Is it an attempt to disrupt black's solid setup, or a strategic concession of central control in exchange for a lead in initiative? Exchanging pawns here on d5 signals a shift, potentially opening lines for both sides, but also creating a slightly less robust pawn shield around black's king in the long run. This captures initiates a central pawn structure negotiation that demands careful maneuvering to avoid positional weaknesses. Shifting the bishop to this active square prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside and aims to control key diagonals, while simultaneously reinforcing the e4 square that might become a target. Challenging the central pawn structure, this move immediately aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and create counterplay on the queenside. Black understands the importance of active piece play and is willing to accept a slightly less solid pawn formation for dynamic opportunities. The queenside expansion is now a key objective, seeking to exploit any misplaced pieces from white and potentially open lines towards the enemy king. Relocating the bishop to e2, white seeks to consolidate its central presence and prepare for kingside castling, while also potentially freeing the queen's diagonal. This move subtly aims to enhance piece harmony, anticipating future pawn pushes that might strain the initial light-squared bishop's position. It prioritizes safety and measured development over immediate confrontation. Proactively securing the queenside pawn chain with b6 aims to prepare for the eventual c4 push, challenging white's central control and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Securing the monarch's sanctuary, the castling maneuver effectively disentangles the king from the center's potential crossfire and activates the rook, initiating a period of relative positional consolidation for white. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal aims to apply pressure towards white's kingside and potentially challenge the f3 knight if white isn't careful, while also preparing for potential central pawn breaks. Finally, focusing energy on the king's file, this deployment seeks to establish a battery along the d-file, potentially pressuring black's central pawn structure if it ever ventures forward, while also preparing for a potential central pawn push later. Reactivating the e-file is a smart idea, as it brings your rook back into play and potentially contests the open file that has emerged. Consider how this repositioning could disrupt white's plans if they aim to dominate the central files. Liberating the queen's bishop with this capture opens a crucial diagonal for immediate development and potential pressure along the d-file. Recapturing the pawn opens lines for your pieces, particularly the bishop on b7, which can now eye the central squares more effectively. This exchange rebalances the pawn structure, shifting the focus from pawn tension to piece activity and the fight for central control. Be mindful of the doubled c-pawns that white now possesses, which could become a weakness later, but also understand that this also gives white a more compact central structure. Your next steps should involve developing your remaining pieces harmoniously, perhaps bringing the queen's knight into play and looking for opportunities to pressure white's somewhat passive queen. The position is dynamic, and careful maneuvering will be key. Initiating a kingside expansion while simultaneously challenging black's queenside pawn structure. This maneuver seeks to gain control of the open c-file and pressure the vulnerable c5 pawn, potentially leading to a favorable pawn majority in the center or on the queenside if black cannot adequately defend. A bold assertion of counterplay emerges, immediately challenging the queen's alignment and aiming to disrupt white's developing harmony. Black boldly repositions their most powerful piece to a more active square, eyeing potential tactical opportunities on the queen's side while simultaneously preparing to activate the light-squared bishop. This move injects dynamism into the position, forcing white to reevaluate their pawn structure and piece coordination, especially concerning the d4 pawn and the open c-file. It signals a desire to seize the initiative and prevent white from achieving comfortable control. The knight embarks on a fascinating journey, aiming to influence the kingside defense or perhaps find a more active square on g6, putting pressure on black's center and potentially creating imbalances. Establishing a robust central presence and preparing to contest the d-file is the core idea behind bringing the rook back into active service. Sharpening the central tension, this knight boldly ventures towards black's vulnerable king's flank, aiming to exploit the now somewhat exposed f-file and potentially create mating threats or disrupt black's defensive harmony. Seeking sanctuary for the bishop, this move aims to reposition the dark-squared bishop from its somewhat exposed diagonal to a more secure square, preparing to contest the crucial e-file should it open further and potentially supporting a future c4 advance or even a more ambitious queenside pawn push. Injecting a knight to nb5 boldly stakes a claim in the queenside territory, challenging black's pawn structure and potentially opening lines for future queenside play. It's a probing maneuver designed to disrupt black's development and create imbalances. A fascinating shift in focus, redeploying the knight towards the kingside's periphery, implicitly acknowledging white's territorial advantage on the queenside and aiming to neutralize the knight on f5, rather than directly challenging the bishop on b7. Asserting pressure on the central squares, the bishop advances to a commanding diagonal, aiming to exploit the slight disorganization in black's pawn structure and potentially prepare a kingside assault by clearing the e-file for other pieces. A bold decision to disrupt white's bishop pair, though it surrenders the highly desirable dark squares around black's king to white's knight and queen. A sharp central pivot, this knight repositioning ignites the d-file and pressures the very heart of black's camp, potentially unraveling pawn structures with its advanced presence. Liberating the b-file and creating counterplay against white's queenside is the immediate goal as black activates their rook, challenging the pawn structure and aiming to exploit the open lines that might emerge. Seizing the undefended b7 pawn, white creates an immediate material imbalance, forcing black to address this new threat while simultaneously considering the vulnerability of their queen. This gambit, though giving up a pawn, aims to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially open lines for white's pieces, especially the rooks. Black must now decide whether to defend the pawn or try to generate counterplay, a choice that will significantly shape the ensuing middle game. Reclaiming the attacked rook solidifies black's central influence, preparing to challenge white's imposing piece on the b-file and potentially opening lines for counterplay. Unleashing a potent central pawn thrust, White aggressively challenges black's pawn structure and seeks to pry open lines for their pieces. This action simultaneously aims to disrupt black's harmony, potentially isolating the queen's knight and creating weaknesses around the king. The immediate consequence is a shift in the pawn dynamics, forcing black to react and potentially commit their pieces to a defensive posture. This pawn push also signifies a transition toward a more open game, where piece activity and control of key squares will become paramount. The rook ventures back to the open file, not to escape danger but to establish a more menacing presence, aiming to exploit any weakness along the b-file as white's queen is now somewhat awkwardly placed. The queen now reclaims its central post, a vigilant sentinel aiming to coordinate its forces on the kingside and potentially support a pawn advance, while simultaneously eyeing any weaknesses that may have arisen in black's setup after the recent exchanges. The queen trade simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where black's active rook on the b-file will be a significant threat against the isolated pawn on a4. The rook now firmly anchors itself on the second rank, aiming to exert pressure on black's queenside and prepare for a potential kingside invasion. Re-establishing central influence, the knight tucks into a surprisingly active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs towards white's uncastled king, while simultaneously preparing to support a d-pawn advance that could shatter the opponent's pawn structure. Establishing a presence on the second rank now frees up your rook on a4, aiming for a more active role in the upcoming exchanges, anticipating black's potential pawn pushes. The knight's leap to e4 injects immediate activity into the center, challenging white's pawn structure and aiming to disrupt the coordinated efforts of white's pieces. This aggressive maneuver forces white to confront a potentially dynamic imbalance, as the knight on e4 controls crucial squares and opens avenues for further development or tactical skirmishes. Asserting control over the critical central files, this maneuver by the rook aims to disrupt black's piece coordination and potentially create pathways for future pawn advances. Seeking to finally wrestle some initiative away from white's well-placed pieces, black ventures into the open d-file, aiming to disrupt white's structural harmony and potentially launch counterplay down this newly acquired corridor. Solidifying the kingside structure is the immediate priority, preparing to activate the central rook and possibly launch a queenside advance, while simultaneously limiting the scope of black's knight. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside to gain a foothold for the knight and prevent white's bishop from becoming too active on that flank. This quiet maneuver for the king aims to secure a safer haven, potentially escaping any future threats stemming from the open b-file or indirect pressure along the d-file. Pondering the pawn structure, black fortifies the kingside with this natural-looking advance, anticipating potential knight incursions and solidifying the pawn chain's foundation. A proactive reorientation of the bishop, this maneuver aims to establish a strong defensive post on the central diagonal, anticipating potential threats against the kingside and preparing for a more active role in the unfolding middle game. Reclaiming the central outpost for the knight, this maneuver aims to redistribute black's forces, preparing for a potential queenside expansion and challenging white's control over the d-file. Reclaiming the knight's central influence is the immediate priority, as its current posting on the edge of the board offers little utility and weakens the pawn structure by exposing the pawn. Embracing the bishop's newfound mobility, black repositions it to a more active diagonal, eyeing the now somewhat exposed kingside and preparing to support potential pawn advances in the center. Unlocking the c-file creates immediate pressure, potentially isolating black's knight on f6 and opening avenues for further infiltration if black isn't vigilant. Liberating the rook from its current defensive post on the d-file, this maneuver seeks to activate it on the open 8th rank, potentially disrupting white's centralized pieces and preparing for future pawn pushes or piece insertions into white's territory. Unlocking the potential of the file, white aims to create active play by repositioning the rook from its somewhat passive defensive square and preparing to challenge black's control. Reclaiming the central squares and preparing to challenge white's knight on a3, this move aims to untangle black's pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay. Unlocking the bishop's potential from its new outpost, this maneuver aims to redeploy it to a more aggressive diagonal, potentially pressuring black's queenside pawn structure or preparing for a central breakthrough. A bold foray into enemy territory, this knight suddenly re-enchants the queenside, posing immediate threats and disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn structure. Securing the b1 square allows this rook to participate actively on the queenside, potentially eyeing the c-file for future pressure, or even a sneaky advance to b7 if the opportunity arises, thereby preventing black's knight from finding a comfortable outpost there and subtly improving white's queenside pawn structure. Re-establishing a blockade on the d6 square is a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to prevent white's knight from advancing further and to secure the bishop's post, preventing immediate threats. The rook's repositioning to d2 offers a flexible pivot, allowing it to either support an advance on the kingside or to join the central fight if opportunities arise. This maneuver seeks to reposition the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside if white's pieces become too uncoordinated. Reasserting control over the central c-file is paramount here, aiming to disrupt black's otherwise coordinated pieces and potentially force weaknesses in their pawn structure by preparing for eventual advances. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal and supporting the knight are the primary goals here, as black seeks to untangle the pieces and prepare for potential pawn breaks in the center or on the queenside. Refocusing the rook onto the second rank, this maneuver aims to challenge the currently passive knight and prepare for potential advances on the kingside, creating a more active presence along that open file. Repositioning the rook to the open c-file aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure around white's king. Repositioning the knight to b1 initiates a strategic regrouping, seeking to unburden the queen's bishop from its defensive burden and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square, perhaps c3 or even d2 if circumstances allow for a more cohesive pawn structure. The king ventures out, seeking sanctuary on the right flank, a subtle repositioning aiming to escape the potential pressure on the center and perhaps prepare for a pawn push later. A quiet repositioning of the knight aims to establish a more central presence and prepare for potential pawn advances, or to defend weak squares on the kingside, potentially reinforcing the beleaguered dark squares around white's king. Asserting control over the open, a file is the immediate priority for black, aiming to disrupt white's rook activity and potentially create counterplay. Initiating a pawn march along the queenside to disrupt black's fianchetto structure and gain central space, possibly aiming for a queenside expansion that can unravel later in the game. The black knight's journey to a6 now becomes a cornerstone of their defensive structure, aiming to reclaim control over the crucial c4 square that white's knight has so effectively occupied. Reinforcing that central control, the rook now occupies a more active file, eyeing potential breakthroughs while maintaining its defensive posture. Unleashing a pawn toward the queenside, black seeks to disrupt white's solid central structure and create their own space for counterplay. This maneuver seeks to activate the knight, aiming to reposition it to a more influential square and potentially create threats on the queenside or in the center as the position simplifies. A bold attempt to create an outpost for the knight, hoping to disrupt white's control over the central squares. Unleashing a knight into enemy territory, this maneuver injects immediate tactical tension, threatening to exploit weak pawns and potentially disrupt black's defensive structure. Capturing the knight eliminates a key defender of white's queenside pawn structure, opening up possibilities for black to exploit the weakened squares. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately initiates decisive pressure, aiming to exploit the passed pawn's advance. Reclaiming the open file for the rook, though it frees white's knight to a more central outpost, also forces a simplification that might offer black some breathing room. Initiating a calculated pawn push to seize control of the crucial central squares and restrict black's bishop. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain now presents opportunities for the black king to potentially become more active, though it also opens up the center for white's rook. Anchoring the pawn chain and solidifying the queenside territory, this move initiates a plan to subtly improve white's pawn structure, creating a new avenue for the king's escape or potential counterplay on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to shatter black's defensive structure and create attacking chances. Opening up that h-file presents a dangerous tactical opportunity that, while seemingly aggressive, could allow white's king to become surprisingly exposed if not handled with extreme care. Unleashing the pawns, this aggressive thrust opens critical diagonals and potential infiltration routes for the king's attackers, transforming the pawn structure into a double-edged sword that demands immediate and careful attention from the defender. The pawn sacrifice opens a crucial diagonal for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create play on the kingside. The white king emerges from its defensive shell, venturing into a newly opened central territory, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame. A desperate attempt to snag a pawn with a sacrifice, but the exposed king makes this a perilous gambit. The monarch bravely steps into the fray, a daring gamble to seize control of the central squares and potentially launch a decisive assault on the enemy king's weakened defenses. Stepping onto the reopened rook file, this piece aims to increase pressure on white's doubled pawns and potentially target the weakened f2 square. Opening up the bishop to pressure the e7 pawn and potentially create new attacking avenues on the kingside creates an interesting dynamic. Unleashing the rook to the 7th rank immediately injects dynamism, aiming to pierce white's defensive structure and potentially liberate the f-pawn's advance. Unleashing the pawn storm creates immediate pressure on black's position, aiming to open lines and exploit weaknesses around the black king. The king, now exposed, must prioritize finding shelter, and the square it seeks appears to be the dark one adjacent to the rook. Bolstering the bishop's presence on d5 now offers improved coverage of the kingside and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queenside, while simultaneously restricting black's knight's mobility. The rook's journey to the f-file aims to disrupt white's imposing bishop and potentially create weaknesses on the kingside, a bold attempt to inject some dynamism into a rather static position. The rook slides along the 1st rank, solidifying its defense of the pawn and preparing to potentially contest the c-file should the opportunity arise, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the advanced black king. The king cautiously steps back, a defensive retreat from the encroaching white pawns, seeking shelter on a more secure square after the recent pawn exchanges that have opened up lines. Initiating the b-pawn advance shores up the kingside pawn structure, simultaneously creating a potential avenue for the monarch to escape the current cramped situation should the opponent's pieces coordinate an attack on the f-file. A crucial defensive maneuver, this knight retreats to a more secure square, preparing to support the rook and potentially counterattack on the queenside if opportunities arise. Re-establishing the rook's presence on the open file immediately after the pawn skirmish is crucial for white to exert pressure on black's potentially vulnerable kingside pawn structure. A noble endeavor to secure the bishop's safety and potentially prepare a kingside sortie, though it forfeits the initiative and allows white's rook to infiltrate the 7th rank unchallenged. Centralizing the rook on the 3rd rank creates a formidable defensive barrier and prepares for potential pawn advances, tightening white's grip on the queenside. Re-establishing a presence on the queenside, this placement seeks to disrupt white's centralized control and prepare for potential pawn advances. A bold repositioning of the bishop, aiming to challenge black's control of the d6 square and potentially create an outpost for a knight should the pawn structure shift. Venturing the bishop back to the c1 square presents a tactical conundrum, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially open lines for black's rook on the 7th rank. Gaining a vital tempo by forcing the black king into a vulnerable square is the core idea behind this aggressive check, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially create mating threats. The black king, having ventured so far from its protective pawn shield, now finds itself under a relentless crossfire, a perilous journey that often ends abruptly when the defense crumbles. The king is truly exposed here, leaving the black monarch a target for immediate threats. Opening up new avenues for the bishop, this maneuver allows the piece to potentially pressure the queenside pawns, or even shift towards the kingside if white's defenses crumble further. Deploying the king offensively, white initiates a daring maneuver, seeking to exploit black's somewhat exposed royal family and create immediate threats in the center. Pushing the bishop back to b4 signals an attempt to reposition this piece for a more active role, perhaps aiming to exploit the queenside if white's king becomes exposed. Targeting the vulnerable b-pawn, white aims to exploit black's slightly exposed king and potentially open lines for attack. The bishop retreats, regrouping its forces after the king's initial escape, now aiming to re-establish its influence on the dark squares. Shifting the bishop to this square aims to create a blockade, preventing black's king from finding any safety or escape along the first rank and potentially limiting its influence in the center. A valiant attempt to stir up some counterplay, but the rook's retreat to f6 feels somewhat passive, leaving the e-pawn vulnerable to further white advances. Initiating a king march, the monarch embarks on a bold journey from the safety of the g-file to potentially participate in the pawn endgame that's rapidly approaching. The bishop vacates its square, potentially preparing a more active role in the center or to support a pawn push, while also untangling the rook on the second rank and acknowledging the ongoing positional struggle for control of key squares. Injecting life into the position, pushing the pawn forward aims to create a passed threat and potentially open lines for the white pieces.